Hey, welcome friends. So what if Naruto x Tomoko x Mariah x time travel movie? Rome, Italy, a beautiful city that many would describe as breathtaking, romantic, and timeless. The people it housed were kind, polite, friendly, and welcomed others to experience everything their home had to offer. The clear skies allowed the beams of light from the sun to cover almost every bit of the land, making it look that much more remarkable. Traits like these would draw any and everyone, including one Naruto's appellee to visit. The young man of 24 was tall even by Italian standards. At 61 he was 4 inches above the average height, and he had his grandfather Caesar to thank for that. Despite having heard a lot about him from his grandmother, he had never seen what he looked like. The pictures his grandma had of the man had lost a battle against time and were mostly faded, though with the technology back in the day he couldn't exactly complain, they worked with what they had. She would always tell him how he looked more and more like Caesar every day. His blonde hair was just as spiky if not a bit shorter in length. He wore black denim jeans and a red shirt underneath a zip-up hoodie that was zipped halfway up with a hood covering his hat. He wasn't much for hats, but when the sun was as bright as today, he didn't feel like holding a hand up to the sky to block it. Having taken most of his traits from his Italian side, he was given a Japanese name to honor the other part of his roots. He got some looks from people upon introducing himself, but he quickly shrugged it off. His name was part of his heritage, and he said it as proudly as he said his last name. "Are you sure you want to go? We can always cancel your flight and get your money back," Naruto heard from behind him. He rolled his eyes lightly, but smiled nonetheless at his mother who stood at the doorway to his room. Breaking his gaze away from the beautiful side of the city from his window, he turned to look at the older woman. "I'm sure mom," he repeated for the umpteenth time today. He loved his mother dearly, but she was quite overbearing at times. The woman pursed her lips and crossed her arms, a telltale sign that she was unhappy. "I still don't understand what your fascination with Egypt is, or where it came from for that matter," she muttered as she walked down the hall. Of course she didn't know, he really didn't know all that well either. Since he was a little kid he found that he could do what many would consider supernatural things. When he was 4, he thought that Head had an imaginary friend. Whenever he needed him he would appear next to him before he could blink. There were no distinguishable features to the person. It was simply a white apparition that would show up whenever it was needed. To the blonde's surprise he found out that no one else could see it. He did everything he could to test if some of his friends could see it, but they all ended in failure. Anytime he went out with his family he'd keep an eye out, hoping to meet someone who could see it, but it never happened. He knew he wasn't crazy, since he could command it to do things for him and affect things in the real world. As he grew up he came to the conclusion that there had to be more people in the world that could do what he could. When he was 14 was the first time he felt a sudden pull, a sudden desire to go to Egypt. He couldn't describe what it was, but it was as if something was calling him there. Unfortunately he didn't have the funds to travel, and thus had to live with the constant want to go. Now though, he had a very large savings account and could finally afford to make the trek out there. The desire had decreased almost overnight one day, but he still needed to know why he suddenly felt the pull. All he knew was that it had something to do with the power he had, and he wanted to know the reason. Had always wanted to travel the world and see how other people lived, and this provided the perfect excuse to leave Italy. Who knows, maybe after Egypt he'd go to another part of the world. Glancing to the small clock he had on his bedside table, his eyes widened when he saw just how close he was cutting it. Summoning his featureless specter he made it finish packing for him at speeds he himself would never be able to match. He wondered if there were people out there using theirs for such insignificant tasks like he was. "Alright mom, I'm heading out, I'll call you when I get there, say bye to dad for me," he said on the way out the door. Making his way down a few flights of stairs of the building they lived in, he made it to the ground floor in under 5 minutes. An older gentleman stood outside a black car with a sign that read Naruto's appellee, letting him know that was his ride. "I got it, it's okay," Naruto said as the man tried to take his luggage from him. Tossing it in the trunk he closed it and made his way to the back seat, where he'd spend the next few minutes as the man drove him to the airport. As he watched the land pass him by through the car window, he couldn't help but wonder what he'd find, the people he'd possibly meet, and the abilities some of those people would possess. He knew they had to have some type of abilities. It wouldn't make sense for it to just be him. He shook his head and cleared his mind. He'd find out soon enough if there was something more to Egypt or not. Though something in the back of his mind told him that he was in for something special. He reached the airport in record time, and after giving thanks to the driver, he made his way through customs. After making sure everything was in order he was given his gate number and had to play another round of the waiting game, fortunately due to how late he'd shown up to the airport. The wait was no more than an hour or so before he and the others on his flight were told they could begin boarding. The flight would only be about 2.5 hours, which was perfect as he wasn't a fan of long-distance flying. He'd do it if necessary, but would avoid it if possible. Shortly after finding his seat and tucking his bag under his seat, he leaned back and waited until the plane departed. 20 minutes later the plane took off, and after a brief moment of being uncomfortable during the takeoff, he was finally on his way. Looking down at the clouds below he couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. He forced that feeling down as being excited would only make the plane ride take longer. Naruto asked a flight attendant if she had any sleeping pills, and fortunately for him she did. 2 pills and a bottle of water later, and he was out for the count. Dream. Why did I think this was a good idea? A frightened 5-year-old Naruto thought to himself. The ball had been playing with had gotten stuck up in a tree in his grandma's backyard. Not wanting to bother his parents, he decided it would be easier to get the ball himself. The tree had some pieces of bark that stuck out just enough for his little feet to use as steps, and as such, it was easy to make his way up. The real challenge, he soon found out, was getting back down. The ball had landed in one of the branches, with plenty of smaller twigs sticking out of it. The quick poke and the ball was freed from its resting place. Unfortunately, Naruto had realized too late that he weighed much more than a ball. Hearing the creaks from the base of the branch had shimmied across the realization that he would fall began to settle in. Naruto could feel his heart beating quickly, adrenaline rushing through his body preparing him for the accident that was to come. He wanted to yell and call out for his parents, but couldn't, afraid that any small movement, even inhaling, would only speed up the branch's destruction. His eyes widened in fear as the branch finally gave out and he felt himself plummet to the ground. It wasn't exactly a high fall, but for someone his size, it would definitely break a bone or two. Naruto closed his eyes and braced himself. "Please don't break anything, please don't break anything," he chanted in his mind as he fell. Just as he was about to hit the ground, unknown to him, something sprouted from his body. The blonde felt himself stop, but didn't feel an impact. Opening his eyes, he saw the ground just an inch away from him and his body suspended in midair. Soon he was pulled upright and placed back on his feet. He looked down at himself for a moment, making sure there was nothing wrong with him before looking up at whatever it was that had saved him. What he found would have terrified any other child his age. The figure was lanky, long, and had no face to describe, no noticeable marks on its body. It was as if God had created a blank canvas and given it life. Bizarrely, it resembled something akin to a wooden doll shaped like a person and let it go as it was, but Naruto didn't feel frightened of such a being. It was strange. He felt something akin to familiarity with it. Tenderly he reached out, wrapping his small hand around its much larger bright white hand. It was soft and warm to the touch much to his surprise, and to his delight the figure's appendage wrapped around his. This was the day his life changed forever. XXXXXXXXXX. Naruto watched as the large man before him marched his way with a frown on his face. The man had his fists clenched and a snarl on his face. Clearly he hadn't taken too kindly to his younger brother having been beaten up at school. The blonde didn't feel the least bit of sympathy for the guy though. He was a bully who liked to pick on the weak, and when he was confronted by someone who could fight back, his first response was to call for help. Pathetic. Still, the behemoth before him wouldn't go down with his fists alone. Naruto was confident in his fighting abilities, had asked to take lessons to defend himself shortly after his 8th birthday, and had honed his skills since then. It wasn't only for himself, but for another close reason. Naruto had developed a stronger relationship with the figure that had saved him all those years ago. He learned that with mental commands he could control the figure and have it do his bidding, like he was about to do now. The large man swung a fat arm at him which was easily ducked. He knew they couldn't see it, had tested the theory when he started school, so he knew what was coming would go smoothly. A spectral arm overlapped his own and connected with the man's flabby chin. Everyone's eyes widened in complete shock as the man's body lifted into the air a few feet before crashing back down. His body landed and created a small crater in the ground, with his eyes rolled into the back of his head. Looking over at the younger brother who was looking at him with unbridled fear in his eyes, he simply nodded his head in another direction. Beat it. The boy didn't need to be told twice and promptly ran while screaming obscenities and promising revenge. Naruto simply stared at his spectral friend with a smirk, and while it didn't have a face, it turned back its head in his direction, and he knew it would be smirking if it could. Please keep your seatbelts fastened and hand all trash to attendants as we will be arriving in Cairo shortly, thank you. Naruto's eyes opened slowly at the loud announcement made by the captain of the plane and sat up straight. He rubbed his eyes lightly as he got his bearings together. It had been a while since he dreamed about when he first realized what he could do. Maybe the prospect about finally getting some closure caused it. He wasn't sure, but he didn't dwell on it too much longer. The plane soon landed and he was free to take his things. The security in Egypt was a lot more lax than it was in Italy, and he was out of the airport in less than 20 minutes. The first thing he noticed was it was hot, really fucking hot. He took his hoodie off leaving him only in his red shirt and called for a cab. Fortunately it wasn't too hard and the driver even recommended a nice hotel that was relatively cheap in price that offered breakfast. Once he made it and unpacked, he opened his window and took in the view from the 14th story. Well, I'm here, now what? He asked himself. He didn't feel any different than when he left. Wait, he mumbled. Cruel reality, he said as a white glow enveloped him. Soon his specter appeared next to him, looking as devoid of characteristics as the first time had been summoned. The only difference now was that it was taller and had beefed up some, even though there was no skin on it, he could tell how much it had grown alongside him. Now that it had been summoned, he felt it, his head turned to the left, and he could feel a strange sensation coursing through him. It was a weaker form of what Head felt all those years ago, but he still recognized it. Whatever it is he was supposed to find was close, and in that direction, he headed to the small fridge provided to him in the room and pulled out a bottle of water. He chugged it down and relished the cold liquid as it poured down his throat. Once done, he crushed it and took it with him as he exited the room, making sure to throw it into the appropriate waste bin that was at the lobby of the hotel. After pulling out his wallet and making sure he had ample money, he began making his way down the bustling streets. Kids ran by him as they played together, merchants were restocking their products trying to keep up with the demand, and civilians going about their day littered the streets. Even though most of the buildings had similar color schemes, there was something about it that just looked amazing. Pyro had this personality to it that he just couldn't describe. It's a lot more lively than I've heard, he thought to himself. He blinked momentarily when the feeling came back and turned his head once more to see a rather small building in the distance. It looked like a pub from what he could see. Looks like him going for a drink, he mumbled with a slight chuckle. If that's where destiny wanted him to go, then who was he to resist? The walk didn't take long, and soon he found himself in a lavish-looking bar with dim lights and a rectangular bar in the center of the room. Tables and chairs were mostly vacant, giving him the notion that this was more of a nightlife spot. Glancing around the room, he found a few people, but none that stood out, not until he walked around the bar and saw a single figure sitting by herself. The woman had long, wide, almost lavender-colored hair with black glasses resting atop her head and wore, from what he could see, a short black dress that gave one a great view of her brown legs. Along with it, she had what seemed to be a long-sleeve shirt that was unbuttoned and covering her arms only, exposing her shoulders. In her hand, she had a lit cigarette that she would take a pull from every minute or so. Did the universe bring me here because it's trying to play matchmaker? He thought to himself in slight disbelief. He knew his mom wanted him to find a special someone, but he didn't think her prayers were so strong the world was actually answering. Still, Hess made it this far, and his intuition hadn't let him down before. Making his way over, he stood behind the open stool next to her. "You mind?" he asked as he put his hand on the back of the chair. The woman looked him over quickly and shrugged, motioning her hand for him to have a seat, but never verbally answered. Thanking her silently, he took a seat and made eye contact with the bartender. Giving the selection a quick once over, he made his choice and had a small shot glass placed in front of him. While not much of a drinker, he didn't mind one or two to relax and unwind. A few minutes passed with nothing out of the ordinary occurring, and Naruto began to think maybe this was all his mind just playing tricks on him the entire time. After all, why Egypt specifically? "Not much of a talker, are you?" he heard the woman next to him say after a pull from her cigarette. "I'd like to think I am," he responded. "I was going to strike up a conversation, but I thought to myself how many guys probably tried that today. If you were here in the daytime, I figured you needed some time to yourself." The woman smirked and pressed her cigarette into the small glass ashtray that was set in front of her before dropping it completely. "Most of the men today didn't seem to understand that. You're different though, I can tell," she said, piquing his curiosity. "How so?" he asked curiously. The woman placed her elbow on the counter and rested her head on a closed fist. "There's a certain air about you that tells me so," she responded softly. Momentarily sitting upright, she offered her hand. "Mariah," she said, introducing herself. "Naruto Zappelli." "Japanese, Italian?" she guessed after hearing his name. Naruto smiled. "Correct, American." He guessed back. If the smirk on her face was anything to go by, he probably guessed correctly. "So what brings you here, Naruto?" she asked after motioning the bartender for a drink. "Other than a drink, of course," she clarified. The blonde took a sip of his second drink that Head ordered after Mariah introduced herself and placed it back down. He thought about the question and how he should answer. What could he say? He didn't know. Something in his mind just told him to show up. Having seen him ponder the question, Mariah pressed on. "When you sat down, it looked like you were waiting for someone or something." Seeing no other choice, he decided to be frank with her. Worst case scenario, she laughs him off in disbelief, and he can continue what he was doing. He didn't get the chance to speak, however, as the moment he was about to respond, the door to the pub opened in a violent fashion, the doors slamming against the walls. Naruto heard the bartender sigh in exasperation and saw him keep a hand under the bar, no doubt getting a weapon ready if necessary. Looks like this is a regular occurrence, Naruto thought to himself. He raised an eyebrow as three men approached them, all with smug looks on their faces. They reminded him of those bullies that tried to pick on those weaker than them back in high school. The three stopped right behind them, all ogling Mariah for a moment before turning their attention to him. "Hey, you're in my seat talking to my lady, move it," the leader ordered. Naruto glanced back at the white-haired woman who seemed to be trying not to snicker. She managed to get herself under control and shook her head no. Seeing as they were full of shit, he resolved himself, "I hate making a mess for people, but it looks like there's no choice," he said to himself as he stood up, "make me." The three guys glanced at each other for a split second and nodded. One slipped his hand into his pocket and Naruto knew he was reaching for some sort of weapon. At that moment an idea came to mind. Something had led him to this pub, specifically, something had led him to Mariah. Maybe this was the moment he was waiting for. If she's really the reason I'm here, then she should be able to see it then, he thought to himself. His excitement showed as a large smile appeared on his face, much to the anger of the three men and the curiosity of Mariah. "Cruel reality," he whispered. The men's eyes didn't follow the figure that stood behind Naruto, they couldn't see it. Mariah on the other hand, her eyes were fixated on the human-like featureless specter that was behind him. "He has a stand," he heard her whisper to herself. "A stand? Is that what they're called?" He thought to himself. That was besides the point though, she could see it. Which meant she most likely had one as well. Just before the leader took a step forward intent on knocking him out, Cruel Reality's featureless body instantly changed. Eyes opened up where the eye sockets would normally be, as well as all along its arms and torso. The eyes blinked together in sync the way a normal person did. The Mariah who was watching in fascination, that was all they did. However, there was more to it than simply opening eyes. In Naruto's mind he watched as a film seemed to play out before him. The man who reached into his pocket pulled out a small knife and attempted to stab him the moment he dodged a punch from the leader. Meanwhile the man all the way in the back seemed to have a smarter approach and did nothing. Instead he watched what happened with a panicked look on his face. As suddenly as the film reel had appeared in his mind, it was gone. That was one of the effects of his stand. It had allowed him to peek 5 seconds into the immediate future, giving him a large advantage in most situations. Not only did it let him see seconds ahead, but while he was viewing no time actually passed in the real world. He blinked and came back down to earth just as the first man threw a sloppy overhand right. Maybe his speed and strength would be enough to get him far against normal thugs, but he was far from normal. He moved aside, letting the punch hit nothing but air, and without turning his head, parried the second man who had indeed brought out a knife and attempted to stab him. Commanding his stand to attack alongside him, he threw a straight right into the man's unguarded chest with immense force. Needless to say he didn't stand a chance and was sent flying into one of the tables on the other side of the room. Taking advantage of the leader's shocked expression, he kneed the man in the gut, then followed it up with an elbow to the back of the neck. The man's eyes rolled back into his head and unluckily for him, his head also bounced off the countertop of the bar, creating a large gash on his forehead. Naruto looked at the last member of the group who stared at him, then back to his fallen comrades. It was almost amusing how the man just shook his head, raised his arms in defeat and walked right out of the establishment. "Sorry for the mess," Naruto apologized to the man behind the bar. "Not necessary, they've been a pain around here and continuously harass our customers because no one dares stand up to them. I'll have some people dispose of them," the gentleman replied as he snapped his fingers. Taking a seat once more he turned to see Mariah now sitting upright facing him. Her bored expression was now replaced with a look of intrigue. She leaned a bit closer to him and spoke, "So you're a stand user huh? I knew there was something about you." Her smirk returned to her face, along with a triumphant air to her. "I am," he confirmed, "I'm going to assume you are too." She nodded. "You asked me what brought me here. The short version is I had a strong desire to come to Egypt for almost a decade now, but didn't know why and didn't have the means. Something told me to come here for some reason, and I wanted to know why," he began. "I thought by coming here, I would probably be able to find more people like me, and it looks like I was right." Mariah pulled out another cigarette and took a pull before replying, "Well, I think I can tell you why you wanted to come here back then." The woman went on to tell him about the event that took place all that time ago, about a man named Dio who gathered stand users to try and kill off a man's bloodline in order to fully take control of the world. It was definitely a strange tale, but he knew the woman wasn't lying. Things added up. If there were that many stand users here at once, that must have been the reason for the pull he felt. "That's a lot to take in," he confessed, "so you were one of the people that worked for him?" The woman nodded and he saw a look of slight regret mar her face. I hurt a lot of people in the process, all because I let myself get talked into this for the amount of money he was offering. After almost being killed, I constantly thought of everything I'd done and have been trying to right my wrongs," she confessed. "Wow, that's pretty incredible honestly. What brought you back to Egypt? If you ever left?" "I did leave, but this is where I caused the most damage, so I've returned to try and see if I can find peace within myself. I've donated money, helped out at different hospitals, you name it, and over the past year I've probably done it," she said. Naruto nodded to himself, sounded like she was doing a decent job, "So why are you still here?" I'm not really sure, I have no family to return to and no real aspirations in life, so I'm just wondering now, seeing where I can help someone. How about you? Now that you found another stand user, what are you gonna do now? She asked. The blonde hummed to himself for a moment, not sure honestly. I didn't have a plan when I came here, I just played it by ear. I've always wanted to travel the world, and this was the perfect excuse to do so. Who knows, maybe I might find some adventure along the way, he told her. Adventure, huh? Mariah muttered as she took another drag of her cigarette. She thought back to what she could consider her adventure all those years ago, and rather than fill her with joy and good memories, they did the opposite. How long are you staying in Egypt? A little while, gonna take in the sights, soak up the culture and enjoy myself. From there I'll probably go to another country and repeat, he replied. Mariah stared at him for a moment, almost as if weighing her options. Would you mind some company? She offered. Naruto raised an eyebrow. You're the first stand user I've met in a while that isn't some twisted fuck. Plus, like I said earlier, there's a certain air about you. Something tells me you're going to find that adventure you're looking for, and it'd be lying if I said I didn't want to be part of something like that, she told him. I'd be lying if he said he won't like some company on his travels, but he couldn't be too trusting. I'd love to have a travel companion, but how do you know you won't get sick of me? We've known each other for a couple minutes, and the only thing we have in common at the moment is that we both use stands. Mariah's respect for Naruto rose a few points at his response. She was half expecting him to say yes like any other hot-blooded male. She wouldn't be opposed to having fun with him. He was a good-looking guy, even if he did look a few years younger than her, but the fact that he could think with upper head impressed her. He was thinking about making sure she was sure about her choice. That's true. Well, you're gonna be in Egypt for a while, right? Let's use that time to get to know each other. Sound good? She proposed. Deal. The two shook hands once more and after paying for the drinks they'd had, left the pub together. 1 year later. So where to now? Mariah asked as she got dressed. After leaving the pub together a year ago, the two went around Egypt simply enjoying the sights, helping people along the way, and overall immersing themselves with what the country had to offer. They soon realized they got along rather well, and a few months after traveled to England. Along the way they encountered a handful of other stand users, some were friendly and some not so much. Despite the battles had against these people, none of them really satisfied him. He still had a feeling in his gut that told him he hadn't reached where he needed to go. Meeting Mariah was only the first step in his journey. Japan, I've heard of certain things happening in a place named Morioh that can't really be explained normally, plus that feeling I had about going to Egypt years ago returned, which means there's probably a good number of stand users there, Naruto explained as he put his black hoodie on. Well, you've been spot on so far, no reason to doubt you now. Have you bought the tickets? She asked, putting her shoes on. He nodded. Yup, we leave tonight, he told her. The woman shook her head in disbelief. He hadn't even given her a heads up, now she had to hurry and pack, not that they had much, but still. Later that night as they sat in their seats on the plane, Naruto stared out the window, watching the lights disappear below the clouds in the sky. What's on your mind? Mariah asked, not taking her eyes off the magazine in her hand. Nothing important, I was just thinking how crazy this is. I wanted to see the world and find people like me. You were looking to find peace and direction in your life, and for some reason we ran into each other, he began. I know you roll your eyes at my corny lines, but I get the feeling the same thing is going to happen on this trip to Japan. I really think that some people are just fated to meet each other, he finished. Naruto didn't know it yet, but upon reaching Japan, had found out how true those words really were. They'd been traveling together for well over 3.5 months now, and in that time Mariah came to think that perhaps joining him was the best idea she'd had. Unlike when she served Dio, she was free to do what she wanted, see what she wanted, and whatever else caught her fancy. At the moment what caught her fancy was watching her travel partner stare in awe at the Great Pyramids. The blonde was taking pictures from all different sorts of angles in an attempt to capture the best images of the monuments. Don't you have the Colosseum back home? Compared to that, this is a little underwhelming, don't you think? She asked as she stood beside him, lighting up another cigarette as she did so. Naruto looked over at her with a look on his face that made her think she was missing something. Yeah, but that's not a pyramid now, is it? He shot back before going back to taking his pictures. The white-haired woman shook her head in disbelief but said no more. She supposed she couldn't blame him for his excitement. Having never left Italy and seeing the Colosseum on a regular basis, this was probably a welcome change for him. The woman raised an eyebrow when he came up to her and handed her the camera before backing away. Seeing the look on her face, he elaborated, I need you to take a picture of me, so it looks like I'm touching the top with my finger, he explained as he stood on a rock and pointed his finger downward in the air. Mariah put the cigarette out, making sure to step on it well, so it wouldn't continue burning, and flicked her hair to the side. Aiming the camera in his direction, she made motions with her hand telling him to move slightly to the right after clicking the button and making sure to take an extra just in case she nodded to him so he could come retrieve it. You know, for a stand user who's trying to find an adventure, it's kinda cute seeing you act like a common tourist, she teased with a small smirk adorning her face. Naruto took no offense to that and smiled good-naturedly at her. Technically I am a tourist, I did say that I wanted to see the world, and here I am doing just that, remember Mariah, you should always enjoy the little detours to the fullest, he replied. He blinked for a moment as he saw an elderly couple trying with some slight difficulty to get a picture of themselves in front of the pyramid and offered to help. Mariah, come over here, he called out after handing back the camera to the couple. As soon as she was within a foot of him, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders and pulled her close to him facing the old woman with his camera. They were nice enough to offer to take a picture of us in return, now smile, pushing aside her momentary surprise, she brushed some hair away from her face and behind her ear, reaching around she wrapped her arm around his body and smiled for the camera. Sounds like she took more than one, so when we get these developed you can get one too, he said with excitement. As much as she tried to seem nonchalant about it, his smile was contagious and she soon found herself matching his grin. If the Mariah working for Dio could see her, now she won't even recognize her. Taking a few steps forward to match his stride, she tucked her hands into the pockets of her denim shorts and spoke, you know they're swindling you out of money trying to get you to go on that tour inside the pyramid, right? Don't waste your money, it's just an empty room, all the treasure was stolen thousands of years ago already. While it might sound like she was being a downer, she really was trying to help him save his money. She'd been on that tour before and it was more underwhelming than anything she could have imagined, but then again, considering the activities she'd partaken in over the years, nothing would really match that level of excitement as easily. Naruto looked back at her and shook his head, don't worry about that, I know it's a scam. So where are we headed? She asked in a confused tone. The sun is about to set so we're pretty much done here, I was thinking we could go to dinner tonight, he offered, that restaurant at the top floor, you know the one right? Got reservations if you're interested, he added. Mariah smiled, well how can I refuse something like that, she replied, wrapping one of her arms around one of his. They'd taken to walking together like that lately and neither of them minded, it had been by accident one day as they made their way through a heavily crowded street and once they had broken free simply stayed that way. Now it had become something of a habit and as long as neither said anything, it would continue. Mariah smiled to herself at the memory, their following trip to England had been even more memorable, not for the sights of course, but because the battles they fought there had helped her learn more about her blonde-haired companion. One thing she learned was that he didn't rely on his stand alone for fights if it could be helped. He understood his stand's abilities incredibly well and used them in conjunction with his own physical ability to end fights quickly. The thought of his stand caused her to pause for a moment, she'd seen it multiple times now, and while it wasn't as flashy as some of the others they had encountered in the past, like Magician's Red and Hermit Purple, it was definitely on another level. Up there with the likes of Jotaro's Star Platinum. Damn, I hate long flights, Naruto complained, holding on to his back as he tried to stretch. Sitting in a seat for well over 13 hours was not something he'd like to do, sometimes he wished he had the ability to fly, maybe he'd be able to travel faster. I don't know why you're complaining, you slept through most of it somehow, Mariah replied without peeling her eyes away from the luggage conveyor belt. Yeah, but I still feel the soreness in my back, Naruto muttered to himself. His eyes scanned the belt until two familiar-looking bags emerged from the flaps and onto the belt. Moving through the small crowd he reached over and with little difficulty picked up both of their luggage and rolled them over. Placing hers next to her, Naruto nodded his head, come on, our driver should be waiting for us just past customs. Customs in Japan was much more strict than it was in Egypt, they were asking basic questions about what they were doing, how long they would stay, and a few other things before they were allowed through. So how do we get to Morioh from here? Mariah asked as they walked out of the airport, the air was cool and the scent of the ocean invaded their scent. Naruto looked around for the man holding up a sign with his name and smiled when he saw him, unlike the driver he got in Italy, this one seemed to be a younger man, perhaps in his early 30s dressed in a suit, he was looking around and waved when he noticed the pair. That's going to take us to the train station where we'll catch the train to the city, from there it's a small walk to the Morioh Grand Hotel, he explained as he let the man take his luggage. He walked over to the door which opened on its own and extended a hand for the woman to take and step inside. I thought the last thing you wanted to do after a 13-hour flight was sit some more, she teased, scooting aside for him to join her. Stepping into the car he buckled up, leaned back, and extended his legs as far as he could. His knees cracked with a loud pop and Naruto couldn't help but let out a satisfied groan at the feeling. I don't think Joseph Joestar's knees cracked like that, she whispered to herself in amusement. She had to turn away when the blonde turned to look at her with an accusatory gaze. Mariah had to look away to stop herself from breaking out into laughter as the thought persisted in her head. Naruto chose not to comment any further and focused his attention out the window, enjoying the new scenery that passed him by. Japan was different from anything he'd experienced, but not in a bad way. The architecture was incredible, and the aesthetic it had was definitely pleasing. He made a mental note to come back to this part of Tokyo when their business in Morioh was finished. That was of course assuming everything went smoothly and they weren't sent off on an adventure somewhere. The train station was only a short drive away, and soon they were once again queued up to take the 4-hour train ride to Morioh. Impressively, it arrived at the exact moment the sign on the guardrail said it would. Punctuality was something the Japanese prided themselves in, and it showed. Finding their seats was no trouble at all, and they were once again seated for the last leg of their journey. The first 2 hours were uneventful, boring almost. That was until Naruto spotted something out of the corner of his eye. A shadow-like object phased through seat after seat, reaching into people's pockets and pulling out belongings. The stand, Naruto thought to himself as he followed its movements. Someone's using their stand to rob people while they sleep. They can't see it, so they'd never be able to guess who robbed them. He continued to track it, making sure not to move his head too much and give away what he'd noticed. "Do you see that?" he heard Mariah whisper to him. "Yeah, I can't tell who the user is though," he whispered back. "So what do we do?" Naruto thought for a moment, planning out his course of action. "You head towards the restroom in the back of the compartment, but make no indication that you know it's there. When it gets close, use your stand, use your new ability to attract the metals it's stolen, then keep your eyes peeled for whichever passenger looks surprised." The woman nodded. "What are you going to do?" "The moment it gets held in place for a moment, I'll use my own stand to punch it, then we just have to see who takes damage," he explained. Mariah stood up and began making her way towards the back, being as discreet as she could possibly be. Naruto kept his eye on the shadow and waited. Just as it passed by the middle row, he saw it momentarily stop and move to one side, and he knew that was the signal. Rushing over, his stand appeared in a flash of light and threw a punch directly at the shadow. He was stunned when the punch didn't connect with the black mass and instead went directly through it. "Fuck, looks like it's only solid when it wants to be," he thought angrily. The shadow sank into the ground without a trace, and instantly, eyes appeared on Cruel Reality's body. Thanks to this, he was able to dodge just in time as a claw swiped at the area where his head would have still been. The spectral hand launched out at immense speed, managing to make contact with the hand that had attacked. The sound of a man crying out rang out towards the front of the compartment, and they knew they had him. The man was nothing more than a high schooler. He had a shaved head and wore a standard green-colored school uniform. Seeing them make their way over, he tried to make his way out but stopped after taking a single step. "But the kid said in shock, looking down. "This wasn't here." "I'm sure it wasn't," he said with a fearful tone. Naruto smiled and pointed at his stand, which had now turned completely black with multiple eyes open. Each eye had a different color iris and blinked independently of one another in an almost hypnotic fashion. "Right after I attacked you, I used one of my stand's abilities to set a trap after knowing Yao'd try to run. Needless to say, now that Yao've touched the electrical outlet, my friend over here decides if you can move or not," he said, motioning to Mariah. The white-haired woman smirked at him and willed all the items he stole to quickly return to him, each hitting him at the same time since they'd all been with his stand. The noise from the impact alerted everyone on board to wake up and see what all the commotion was about. Those wanted possessions stolen patted themselves down and realized that their belongings were now with the kid and were immediately up in arms. Naruto smirked to himself as he made his way back to his seat. The staff would be able to handle it from here. Part of him was happy. If he'd met a stand user here already, that meant his hunch about Morioh seemed to be correct. "We haven't even arrived and we're already meeting other stand users," Mariah groaned as she sat back in her seat. "Looks like we're gonna be right about this again," she added, referring to his choice of coming to Morioh. Naruto smirked, which aggravated her, knowing he was going to get a big head over hearing her admit he was right about something. "I told you, we're going to meet some interesting people here." Neither of them said anything after that, both lost in their own thoughts. Naruto was excited at the prospect of what was to come, while Mariah was slightly worried. While she was glad her stand had developed to the point where she had new abilities, she knew that wouldn't be enough for some of the more powerful stand users. People like Dio, Jotaro, and even Naruto, when it came to both physical ability and stand ability, they were in a class all their own. When Shed learned of the things Naruto's stand could do, she was shocked. Power like that was unnatural. It made her feel both safe and frightened at the same time. Safe because she knew that he had her back and those abilities would save her if need be. Frightened because there was always the chance that he could see her as a hindrance to him and ditch her. She'd never tell him, but he was perhaps the best thing that had happened to her. Shoving those thoughts out of her head, she relaxed her breathing and closed her eyes. Naruto looked over at her and couldn't help but feel a little proud. Her stand had developed a great deal since he first met her. Her power with magnetism was astounding, and he knew with a mind as cunning as hers, it would be a force to be reckoned with. Looking at the small screen that rested in the back of the seat in front of him, he saw that they still had a little while to go before arriving at Morioh Station. Following her lead, he steadied his breathing and closed his eyes. Morioh Station. Finally, we made it, Naruto commented excitedly. Walking out of the station he took a look around, and he was definitely liking what he saw. It was a colorful place with bits of the road being green in certain places, and plenty of happy-looking people going about their daily lives. While it wasn't as extravagant as it was back home, this place had its own identity that made it unique. "You look so excited to be in a small town," his partner commented with a chuckle. "It's not so much the place that I'm excited for, but rather what's waiting for us here. The moment we arrived, I could feel something around here," he replied. Glancing around a little longer he tried to see if there was anyone out of the ordinary that could potentially be a stand user. Unfortunately everyone around seemed to be rather plain looking, salarymen walking to work, women and kids walking together to different stores, and high school students making their way to school. That was all he saw, but he knew there had to be more. He looked at one high school student across the street and frowned in confusion at what he saw. "What's wrong? Did you find one?" Mariah asked, her guard up as she scanned the area. "What's with their uniforms?" Naruto asked, pointing at the youth. He was a rather tall boy with a strange haircut, but that wasn't what had him confused, it was the uniform he wore. Those around him wore a green traditional-looking outfit, consisting of a buttoned-up jacket and matching pants. This one wore a dark blue-colored uniform which wouldn't have been a problem if it didn't have 3 large money signs on it. On his collar he had a Japanese yen symbol and a US dollar symbol. On his chest, he had another dollar symbol only much larger. "That can't be allowed," he muttered to himself. Mariah rolled her eyes and began rolling her luggage down the street, trying to find a cab to take them to their hotel. It only took them a few minutes to find a ride and make it to their place of lodging, and soon they were checked in and laying on what would be their bed for the foreseeable future. "Well, come on, let's go see what we can find, plus I'm hungry, plane and train food doesn't do it for me. There was a ramen place not too far from here we could walk to," he said. The two made their way out and headed for the small stand. The food turned out to be relatively decent for the price they were charging. Naruto proposed that they just walk around for a while and see what the place had to offer. In the end nothing special came about their walk, no interesting people to take note of, and no one seemingly up to no good. The following day was slightly different though. The pair woke up early in the morning and headed out once more to see the rest of the area. Now that they were well rested from a good night's sleep they felt refreshed and had more energy to burn. That turned out to be a good thing too because that feeling Naruto had when he first met Mariah was back if only slightly different. They were standing near a bus stop with a lot of high school students lounging around while the bus arrived. Some talked among themselves, while others hung out near the fountain a few steps behind. One of interest was a young man with another strange blue uniform, though it was open in the front, revealing a yellow shirt underneath, as well as an ornament of a heart on the lapel. The most memorable thing about him though, was his pompadour hairstyle. Naruto hadn't seen that hairstyle in person and believed that was something only seen on TV. There was something strange about him though, something that drew the eyes towards him. His attention was taken away from the young man by the feeling of a hand gripping his wrist. Before he could ask what was going on, he felt himself being pulled away until they were hiding behind the wall of one of the shops across the street. "What's the matter?" Naruto whispered in concern. "We need to get away from here," Mariah replied, fear seeping into her voice. This had Naruto concerned as had never seen her display such fright. "Why? Who or what did you see?" he asked, seeing as she seemed to be contemplating something. He peeked over just in time to see a large older man dressed in white talking to the same person what caught his attention. For a split second, he saw the man surrounded by a golden aura, and he knew the man was a stand user, a powerful one at that if the presence he commanded was any indication. Looking back at his partner he realized that must be who she saw that shook her up. "That's Jotaro, the guy who beat Dio. I was one of the people sent to kill him and his friends years ago," she confessed. Naruto looked over again to see the two of them talk for a moment before walking off in another direction with a short white-haired student. "Mariah, listen to me, we have to follow them. Trust me when I tell you nothing will happen to you. If he tries anything against you, he'll protect you," he promised. The white-haired woman looked him in the eyes for a moment before taking in a deep breath and nodding. If there was one thing she could trust, it would be his word. Naruto's appellee had never once broken his word, and with the power he held, she had no reason to believe he'd start now. They trailed the group from a reasonable distance until they saw them stop in the street not too far from where they knew the high school was and watched as they spoke. They couldn't make out what they were saying, but it didn't seem to be anything bad. That was until some girls began swooning around him and Jotaro must have said something to upset the young man as a light blue and red stand quickly materialized. He took a swing at Jotaro, but missed and in return got a right to the face. He tried again, but was met with the same result. He must have stopped time in order to appear behind him like that, Naruto concluded. That was arguably the strongest ability he'd seen yet. He wasn't sure what was said after that, but the two students left in a hurry, leaving the man all alone. "You can come out now," he heard Jotaro call out. Naruto smirked. He was good. The duo walked out from around the corner of the house they'd hidden behind, and he noticed Jotaro's eyes narrow slightly at his partner. It was as if he was trying to recall where he'd seen her before. "Who are you two and why did you follow me?" Jotaro asked in a polite tone, with Star Platinum standing behind him with his arms crossed. Naruto summoned cruel reality behind him, causing the man in front of him to tense up. "We mean no harm, I happened to be around, and when I saw you, I knew that you were a stand user like me," he said, pointing to the stand behind him. "It'd be more likely to believe that if you didn't have one of Dio's former assassins accompanying you," Jotaro replied. "Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk at the moment, so I'll make this quick," he said. The two stands met in between the two stand users and began throwing punches at incredible speeds, though it was clear Star Platinum was overpowering his. Star Platinum's repeated cry of aura resonated loudly, and the blonde wasn't sure if that was the reason behind the blows getting heavier. Naruto's arms were beginning to bruise at the knuckles and even bleed due to the blows he was taking. He wasn't worried though, this was nothing more than a test to see what Star Platinum was capable of. Jotaro saw Naruto smirk and knew something was wrong. His guess was correct when eyes began opening all over his stand's body. He didn't know what this new strange ability was, but he knew it wasn't good. He was proven correct when Star Platinum's punches all began getting dodged and some of the blonde's hits began connecting. Naruto's stand began effortlessly maneuvering through his stand's punches and delivering a flurry of its own, each connecting with insane precision. Jotaro's mouth began to bleed due to the internal damage caused, but his face remained unchanged. His demeanor was still stoic, but Naruto could see he was beginning to take things a little more seriously. This was proven true as Naruto's stand saw what was to come and relayed the information to him. In Naruto's eyes he saw the world around him discolor, the environment reflecting all the different colors of the spectrum, before the area took on a grayish tint around them and everything stopped. "Star Platinum's Naruto," Jotaro called out. Just before he activated the technique, he noticed something change. The blonde stand had changed from white to black, and the colors of its eye changed. The cornea still a pale white, but the iris was a terrifying red. Still, whatever it was wasn't enough to counteract the stopping of time. Despite only being able to stop time for a brief moment, that time was used to unleash a barrage of punches all over Naruto's body. Aura. Star Platinum yelled with each punch. When the time limit was nearing its end, it stood back behind Jotaro and crossed its arms. Time soon resumed, and the blonde found himself being sent crashing into a metal gate nearby. He examined the younger man and noticed his face was badly bruised from the many punches he had taken while stopped in time. His mouth, nose, and left eye were dripping blood, and he was sure his left arm was broken. Turning his attention to Mariah, he failed to notice the blonde, and his stand appeared behind him until he felt fists connecting with his cheek rapidly. Knowing what would come next, Naruto sped away until he was far enough to be out of Star Platinum's range. Jotaro stood back up, spitting out some blood from his mouth and wincing slightly at the bruises on his face. His cool demeanor changed to one of shock when he saw the blonde standing across from him completely unscathed, not a bruise, cut, drop of blood, or even speck of dirt on his clothes. "You are wondering how the damage from Star Platinum disappeared, right?" Naruto asked. "Well, since I know how your stand works, I think it's only fair you know how mine works. Cruel reality has 4 main abilities, 2 of which you've experienced," he began. "The first is the ability to see slightly into the future," he said, shocking the man. "The second is a little more complex than that, but basically I can see alternate futures and bring whichever I like into reality." At the explanation, Jotaro quickly connected the dots in his mind. He realized when cruel reality's color was white combined with the eyes, it was peering into the immediate future. That's how he was able to begin to dodge every attack and counter so well. When it turned black with the mismatched eyes, it was peering into different futures to bring forth a best one for him. That was truly a frightening ability. Just as Jotaro was about to speak, he felt the air leave his body and he hunched over in pain. The man didn't have time to think as he felt the blonde's fist connect with his face multiple times. After 10 or so punches, the blonde swept his feet from underneath him. Star Platinum's user cursed himself at that moment for not training much over the past 10 years. If he'd have continued, he could have used the world to freeze time for an extended period and end the battle. All he could do was cover his face and hope the blonde left himself open after he believed himself victorious. After a few seconds with nothing happening, Jotaro took a chance and removed his hands from their defensive position, only to see the blonde standing over him with an extended hand. "I told you we weren't here to cause trouble. I know there's a large number of stand users in Morioh, and that's why we're here," Naruto explained, shaking his hand briefly, encouraging the man to take it. "Your days," Jotaro murmured to himself. Naruto smiled when the man clasped his hand with his own and with a little effort pulled the man back up to his feet. Oh right, cruel reality's color turned black for a moment before disappearing, and in an instant, Jotaro's injuries were gone, though he could still feel a slight throbbing in his cheek from where had taken the hits. Just because a future where you weren't hit was brought forward doesn't mean you won't still feel a bit of what actually happened, Naruto commented. Thanks, I assume you've heard of the happenings in Morioh? Jotaro asked. Naruto and Mariah nodded, that's partially why we're here. I see, the man muttered, I take it y'all be sticking around. That's right, something about this place is different and I'd like to know why, Naruto replied. The older of the two men agreed and was going to continue until he realized he never got the blonde's name. You have me at a disadvantage, you know my name, but I don't know yours. Naruto Zeppeli, he replied with pride. Jotaro frowned for a moment, that name sounded familiar, he knew had heard it before, but couldn't quite remember where or when. Deciding to think about it later, he patted himself down and turned around, nice to meet you, I have business with someone in this town, and like you am looking into certain things regarding stand users, well be in touch. Naruto turned back to Mariah who exhaled a sigh of relief, I think that went pretty well, Jotaro's strong, really strong, that was the most effort I've ever had to put into a fight, he commented excitedly. The woman shook her head, only you would be happy about having gotten into a fight with one of the strongest people on earth. I'm going back to the hotel, I need to lay down for a while, you coming? She asked, looking over her shoulder. He checked the time and saw it was still rather early in the day and shook his head, nah I'll catch up with you later, I'm gonna check the place out more, he said. Mariah shrugged and began heading back to their hotel. With both her and Jotaro gone, Naruto was left by himself to his own devices, stuffing his hands in his pockets. He walked off to see if he could locate any other stand users. With the things going on in the city, he was sure a powerful one was behind the happenings here, either that or a group of them working together. The next hour or so he spent trying to get a feel for the layout of the city and trying to see if there was anything that stood out. Unfortunately, had no luck thus far. He stopped for a brief moment when the sound of people speaking reached his ears. Glancing around the area he couldn't see anyone that might have been responsible for the voices. Sure, people walking past him were talking, but what had heard sounded more demanding. Taking a few steps forward he came across a small alleyway in which he found what he was looking for. Three large men were talking with a police officer, an older man with graying hair wearing a standard police uniform and cap. It looked like had stopped them and was reprimanding them for something, but they weren't too keen to listen. Two of the three were talking back animatedly with frowns on their face, while the last had his hand reaching for his left back pocket. Alright, we won't harass anyone, the one with his hand in his pocket said with a slightly condescending tone. Just as the officer turned around, he struck, or at least he would have had a hand not gripped his wrist, forcing him to drop the small blade that had pulled out. The sound of the metal hitting the floor caught the attention of the officer who quickly sprang into action. Despite his old age, he was quickly able to block the punches that were sent his way by two of the goons and quickly drop them. He was old, but still had the skills taught to him by years in service. Naruto had an even easier time. Adding pressure to the wrist caused it to emit a sickening crunch sound, followed by a cry of pain from the man. A few minutes later a police car was on the scene with other officers escorting the men into the back of the car. Naruto nodded to himself, glad that had been around when he had been. Excuse me young man, Naruto turned around to see the officer had helped. My name is Raihe Higashikata, thank you for your help today, he said with a bow, one that the blonde returned. No problem, when I saw that he was reaching for something I knew it couldn't be good, Naruto Zeppeli by the way. The older man nodded, I've dealt with them many times over the last couple of months, but this was the first time they've actually tried to cause me harm. They usually make up an excuse and leave. That could have cost me my life, he said. The look on his face told the blonde that had an eye-opening experience. Life in Morioh must have been rather easy if a cop like himself hadn't had a life-threatening experience like that yet. It's no problem sir, I'm just glad I was able to help. The man shook his head, you might not think so, but to me it's a big deal. You've all but saved my life today. I know I can never repay you for it, but I can at least show gratitude. I'd be delighted if you would join me for dinner with my family. I'd like them to meet the person who saved my life. Naruto wanted to say no, but seeing how the man genuinely believed he was in his debt, he couldn't find it in him to deny. Taking a deep breath he nodded in confirmation and was patted on the shoulder. Great, hold on one moment and I'll get you the address and the time, Raihe said as he headed to get a notepad from the car. Naruto hoped Mariah didn't mind having dinner alone tonight. If she did, he'd just have to make it up to her. XXXXXXXXXXXXX. Meanwhile at the Morioh Grand Hotel. Yeah, I made contact with him, we'll be speaking again today after Hess out of class, Jotaro said into his hotel room phone. He has a stand, a rather powerful one at that. I see, thank you again for doing this for me Jotaro. The voice of an elder man rang out from the phone. Jotaro's face softened up some upon hearing the gratitude in the older man's voice. "It's no problem, after speaking to him again, I'll continue to look into Katagiri and Juro," he reported. "But good, is there anything else?" he asked. The man clad in white shook his head, even though the man on the other side of the line couldn't see but immediately stopped. An image of a certain blonde crossed his mind for a brief moment. "Actually yes, I met an interesting person today with an incredibly powerful stand. Does this person have a name?" "Naruto Zappelli." The line went silent for a moment and Jotaro worried the old man had fallen asleep. Just as he was about to call out again, the man spoke. "Jotaro, are you sure he said Zappelli? What did he look like?" The old man asked in a tone Jotaro hadn't heard him use in years. He sounded both serious and somewhat hopeful. "Positive, tall, blonde hair, probably Italian if his name suggests anything." The line went quiet again for a moment before the man spoke. "Jotaro, I need you to do something for me, find him again, I'd like to speak with, and if possible meet him, we'll talk again soon, I have to go." With that the line went dead. Jotaro stared at the phone in his hand with a frown on his face. It was clear his grandfather knew something, and it had to do with Naruto's family. If Joseph wanted to talk to him, then it was bound to be something important. He sighed and fixed his hat once more before sitting down and pulling a few pictures out. For one reason or another, he just knew he would be seeing a lot more of Naruto in the near future. Later that afternoon, back at the Morioh Grand Hotel, Naruto kneeled above his open luggage with a pensive expression on his face. He sifted through his shirts and pants, taking them out as he did so, and placing them on the ground next to him. Soon, all of his shirts were sprawled out on the ground in front of him, but it didn't make his choice any easier. "Are you sure you don't want to come with me?" Naruto asked, raising his head slightly so he was peeking over the bed. "Also, you promised to cut back on those," he chastised. Mariah turned her head slightly to look at him, but didn't make any other movements. She was sitting cross-legged on the mattress with the television on and a few newspaper pages from different dates all around her. In her mouth, the white cigarette burned slowly, letting off the nauseous fumes into the air. Seeing the look her young partner was sending him, she closed her eyes and sighed, muttering a quiet apology and reached over to the nightstand. Her index finger pressed down just below the tip of the cigarette until it was put out, then resumed what she was doing. If this had been her from a few years ago, she would've told him to fuck off, but things were different now. Mariah still spoke her mind but was much more reasonable. Apart from that, there was the underlying fact that she appreciated that the blonde saw the good in her, even after she told him about the things she'd done. On a deeper level, she supposed she didn't want to disappoint the one person she now had in her life. "So is that a no?" Naruto tried again. Mariah blinked and looked over at him, then the shirts on the ground, then back at him. Smiling to herself, she shook her head and leaned back against the headboard of the bed. "I think I'll let you deal with that one," she replied, taking pleasure in the deadpan look the blonde sent her way. "Seriously, we haven't been here that long, how the hell did trouble find you that fast?" "It doesn't," Naruto denied. Mariah sent him a scrutinizing gaze which he ignored in favor of crossing his arms defiantly. "Every situation we've gotten into since we started traveling together has been because of you," she accused. "Coincidence?" he refuted. Naruto knew she wasn't done if the victorious smile that appeared on her face was any sign. "Aren't you the one who said you wanted to find other stand users?" she questioned in a false innocent tone, holding a hand up to stop a rebuttal. She continued, "Aren't you also the one that said people are fated to meet? That means you attract all the problematic people we run into." "I said some people," he replied weakly. How dare she twist his own words against him? She had a point, but he would never let her know that. Mariah laughed joyfully knowing she had him cornered. "Nope, you can't just change how you interpret it now." Not wanting to continue the banter any longer since she knew it would ultimately end in him childishly trying to get back at her somehow, she changed the conversation. "Anyways, Apelli, what are you gonna wear?" Her eyes turned to the multitude of t-shirts he had laid out on the ground. Raising a perfectly done eyebrow she spoke again. "Tell me you're not planning on wearing one of those." Naruto looked at the shirts then at the one he was wearing and frowned. "What's wrong with them?" "They're clean, I'm gonna iron them before leaving." His question was met with a blank stare and a shake of the head. "Other than looking like you're gonna hang out with some friends. You have to look presentable." "I've never had a problem with the way I dress before," he pointed out. This time, Mariah actually scoffed. "That's because we're either in some sort of battle or naked in bed. Believe me, if you tried going out in a t-shirt and jeans whenever we went somewhere nice, you would hear it from me." Moving the newspapers out of the way, she got off the bed and sat on the ground next to him. As she rummaged through the rest of his clothing and his luggage, she spoke, this time in a much softer tone. "The man is grateful you saved his life. I know you told him it was nothing special, but it's a big deal to him and his family. The least you could do is look like you're accepting the gesture." She finished. For the next hour, the two went over the clothes he had. They mixed and matched all sorts of combinations until finally, Mariah put something together that was passable. "So what are you going to be doing while I'm gone?" he asked. Hanging the clothes on a hanger, she replied, I'm looking into something, or rather someone. Someone catch your attention. Here's a guy who broke out of jail hiding somewhere in the city, she replied as she took one of the papers into her hands. Naruto rubbed his chin. This wasn't usually the kind of thing they looked into. It sounded more like something the local authorities would be working on. He was missing something. Mariah wouldn't bother herself with this unless there was something else involved. Mariah's gold eyes looked at him momentarily out of the corner of her eye, having been with him for so long. She recognized the questioning look on his face. As a sadistic murderer woes killed quite a few people and even forced himself onto 3 young boys in the past, she informed with a look of disgust on her face. Even during her time serving Dio, she never once thought of simply going on killing sprees and forcing herself onto people. In her mind, this guy was the lowest of the low. The more Mariah spoke, the harder his teeth grit together. It wasn't enough that the guy stole the lives of people, but he also scarred kids. That was unacceptable. Does he have a name? Hatajiri Anjuro, also known as Angelo. Do you think Hess the reason for the disappearing people in the city? Naruto asked, his mind already working on theories as to where one could store that many bodies. The woman shook her head and blew a small gust of air from her mouth to move aside a strand across her face. No, there's too many inconsistencies for it to be him. Seems like Hess just a sick fuck who kills for fun. Naruto hummed to himself for a moment. Jotaro is here for the same thing we are. Maybe he knows something. Morioh isn't that big. How do you think someone as notorious as Angelo could hide without being recognized by anyone? Mariah's slipper-covered foot tapped the ground as she thought it over until it hit her. You think Hess is stand user? The blonde shrugged, maybe. Well, he would certainly have the means to look deeper into it than we do. Did he say anything to you when you were finished fighting? She questioned. Nothing relating to Angelo. He just said he has business with someone who lives in the city, probably the kid with the pompadour he was fighting. He also said we'd be in touch. I'm not sure if Hess gonna call or if Hess just banking on us meeting somewhere. The woman sighed at the vague information her partner was given and let herself fall on the bed again. It wasn't like they were on a time limit or anything, they would figure it out in time. I'm sure he'll show up eventually. For now, just remember to be polite, even if you feel awkward and out of place, she advised. Naruto's shoulders sagged. Looking at her one more time, he pouted, are you sure you don't want to come? His question almost sounded like a plea at that point, but the woman didn't budge. In hindsight he should've known better than letting his discomfort seep into his voice, although they deeply cared for each other. She still got the most enjoyment out of seeing him in what she considered funny situations. With her arms resting behind her head, she winked at him, no thanks, this isn't something I should just involve myself in. Look, just lighten up and be yourself, you might even have fun. Knowing she wasn't going to budge, he made his way into the bathroom to shower. A few minutes later he emerged nice and clean and proceeded to get dressed. The clothes they'd settled on was a white dress shirt that he had tucked into slim black slacks. The shirt left the top 3 buttons undone, giving it a loose feeling instead of his usual sneakers. They had been swapped out with a pair of black dress shoes. Fixing his collar, he looked at the reflection of the mirror to see Mariah staring at him with a hungry look on her face. Smirking inwardly, he turned, so how do I look? A well-dressed man is one of my favorite things to look at, she said in a sultry tone. Even if you don't have a good time at the dinner, I'm gonna make sure you have a good one when you get back, she said slowly, trailing her tongue along her upper lip. Giving her a matching hungry look, he replied, if you continue doing that I might not make it to dinner at all. Mariah tore her eyes away from him and turned back to the TV, get out of here before I jump you. The blonde laughed and made his way out of their room, patting himself down. He made sure he had everything he needed and pulled out the piece of paper that had been given to him, had looked up the address on the map provided in their room and knew where to go. It was simply a habit, he had to double-check things to be sure. XXXX. It took a few minutes to make it to the Higashikata residence, but had made it, the lights were on, and he could see silhouettes moving about from behind the blinds. Making his way up the small path, he stopped and knocked 3 times on the door. One of the shadows crossed through the window, and soon the door was open. Upon seeing the person, Naruto was speechless. It wasn't the police officer as had been expecting, but rather a woman. She had short slicked back dark blue hair that came down to her shoulders and was kept in place by a yellow hairband. Her outfit consisted of a short light blue dress that came down halfway to her thighs and showed a modest amount of cleavage. Her legs were covered by black stockings and she wore dark blue shoes. Over the entire thing was a red jacket that she currently kept open. Realizing that he was staring, he blinked and cleared his throat. I apologize for the intrusion, but is Officer Higashikata here? Like him, the woman had also given him a once-over, though she had been much more discreet in doing so. He is, are you Zeppeli Naruto? She questioned. It still sounded strange to him to hear his family name first, but he nodded at his affirmation. The woman gave a small smile and stepped aside. "Please come in, we've been expecting you, my dad should be down any minute now." "Oh, my name is Higashikata Tomoko, it's a pleasure." "Thank you for having me," Naruto replied politely. He was led to the dining room, and as they walked, the scent of delicious food made its way into his nose. "Whatever you're cooking smells delicious." "I appreciate it," she replied simply. "I hope it's as good as it smells. Also, before we eat, I'd just like to say thank you for saving my father. If we would lost him, I don't know what I'd do." To further show her thanks, the woman bowed low before getting up. He took his seat and luckily, he didn't have to wait long for the older gentleman to make his way into the dining area. At that moment, he was thankful to have had Mariah around, since the man was dressed in a grey suit. "Mr. Zappelli, I'm glad you made it. I hope you're hungry. My daughter has prepared a delicious meal for us tonight," the police officer said after shaking his hand and taking a seat next to him. Before the two men could break out into conversation while waiting for the food to be served, the sound of footsteps drawing closer grabbed his attention. Naruto blinked in surprise seeing the same high schooler that Jotaro had been fighting. Unlike his mother and grandfather however, his outfit consisted of the school uniform he had yet to take off. "Yo," he greeted casually before taking a seat. "Josuke. You can just call me Naruto, I know you go by family name, but it makes me feel a little closer to home," he replied. Their brief conversation was cut short by Tomoko who began setting up plates in front of them, then finally one for herself and taking a seat. After a quick thank you for the meal the family began eating, and sure enough, the food was as good as it smelled. Dinner was a slower affair than he was used to. When it was just him, he would devour the food quickly and spend a few minutes letting it sit. Here though, he took it slow and answered any questions the older man had. It was basic things like why he was in Morioh, how he liked it, plans for the future, and all sorts of other pleasantries. "I do have a question," Naruto spoke after replying to the older man, turning to look at Josuke. He nodded his head to the pins on his uniform. "The school doesn't mind those pins." Referring to the peace and heart on his chest, I'm sure one guy had a $sign on his. Josuke had a look of understanding on his face, knowing who he was talking about. "Well, they do care, just not a lot. At this point they've given up and just let us put them on." "Huh?" Naruto asked, knowing how Japan had a uniform system in place for their schooling. He was surprised they were that lax, though maybe that was just with that school in particular. "I don't think any school back home forced uniforms, part of me wishes we did though." The youngest of the family raised an eyebrow and paused his bite. "Why would you want that?" "Having a uniform means I don't have to worry about what to wear every day. My mom made me wash my own clothes, so at the end of the week, there was always a full hamper," he replied with a shake of his head. Washing clothes was probably his least favorite chore to do. Next to him, Tomoko nodded ever so slightly, completely agreeing with the blonde's words but didn't comment. "I guess that makes sense. Another question for you, it's about your hair." The moment the words left his mouth, the two older folks raised their heads to stare at him with worried looks. They knew how sensitive the young man was about his pompadour, and one wrong word would set him off. Josuke stared back at him with narrowed eyes. Had had enough people fucking with him for his hair at school. "How exactly do you get your hair like that?" "I like it," he wondered. His hands went up to his blonde tresses and tried to make the shape only for it to fall apart and revert to its spiky positions. "I think if I could keep it in place, I could pull it off." All three of the Higashikata family members pictured him with a blonde pompadour similar to Josuke's, only for the image to shatter instantly. "Yeah, I think you could definitely do it," he lied, though his face had changed to one of delight. There weren't too many people who had good taste in hairstyles these days. He wasn't the only one surprised by the exchange. Both his mother and grandfather looked on with wonder in their eyes as the two men began talking animatedly about this or the other. Tomoko, knowing her son could be rude when he felt disrespected, felt a sense of relief that her boy wouldn't be causing any scenes. She knew how important this dinner was for her father. Speaking of her father, the man nudged her in the side with his elbow and gave her a look, one she hadn't seen in years that made her feel like a misbehaved child. She knew what he was asking of her, but after the ordeal with that kid in the car, she wasn't in the most talkative moods. "Well, that was an amazing meal," Naruto announced, happily patting his stomach. Pushing the chair back, he picked his plate up and quickly collected the other empty plates as well. "I'll go ahead and wash these before I go as a thank you for the meal." "You don't have to," Tomoko replied, standing up to chase after the blonde who had made his way to the kitchen. Turning the sink on, he began letting the water flow over the dish. "Oh, it's no problem, it's become something of a second nature. I used to get hit with a wooden spoon if I left dirty dishes when I was perfectly capable of doing them myself," he replied. The woman turned to look at her father who stared back at her and nodded. Standing next to him, she picked up one of the other plates still in the sink and put it under the water. "Fine," she relented, "but I'm gonna do the others." He nodded, that was fine with him. The two stood in silence, each washing their respective dishes, but Naruto noticed that the woman was glancing at him out of the corner of her eyes. For a brief moment he wondered if she was up to something. The option to peek into the future wasn't a possibility since the moment he did so, Josuke would likely believe it to be an attack and respond. "So, what's Italy like?" she finally asked. "Beautiful," he replied honestly, "nice landscapes, rich history and architecture, and the food is to die for." She nodded, "So I've heard." Thinking to herself for a moment, she continued, "I've always wanted to visit a lot of places actually, but I never got the chance. Are the pizza and pasta really as good as they say?" Without hesitation, he responded, "Absolutely, at least compared to any of the places I've been to. I've only been to 3, but I'd consider myself something of a traveler." His words finally managed to crack a smile from her which made him feel pretty good. The entire time they had eaten, she hadn't said a word, and he had been worried he said the wrong thing at some point. It seemed she was just a naturally guarded woman. There weren't many dishes in the sink, but the two took their time, eventually falling into a rhythm where he would wash and shed dry and put away, all the while losing themselves in conversation about some of the things he'd seen on his travels and answering questions she had about the places in question. "I'm still not sure about the pizza though," she commented with a smirk, already knowing how much pride he took in his country's food. "I know a few good spots with great food." Naruto snorted in indignation, "If you want I could cook something up for you sometime, so you can see what real food tastes like." Tomoko raised an eyebrow and turned to look at him. The first thought that came to mind was that punk-ass kid who tried hitting on her earlier in the day that ended with his face smashed in the door. Naruto though, didn't sound like he was purposely hitting on her, even though his words were inviting. Knowing that this would probably be the last time she saw him, she shrugged. "I'll take you up on that one of these days. Don't feel too bad if it falls short to a traditional Japanese dish though," she shot back. This time it was Naruto's turn to smirk. "You'll probably end up wanting me to be a personal chef after tasting real Italian food." Their banter, while surprisingly fun in Tomoko's case, came to an end when there were no more dishes in the sink to be washed. Tomoko turned the water off and handed him a small yellow rag for him to dry his hands with. "Even though you didn't need to do that, thank you for the help. Young men these days aren't exactly courteous," she said, shooting a pointed look towards her son who looked aghast at her declaration. His grandfather sent him a pointed look that said, "Why are you surprised?" Naruto laughed. "My mom always told me she didn't care that I was 24, I would clean up after myself wherever I was." 24? Tomoko asked with a bit of surprise seeping into her voice. "I thought you were a bit younger." He shook his head. "Nope, I'm old," he said, drawing a laugh from the actual senior citizen in the room. "Anyways, it's getting a little late, I don't want to take up all of your time." The others in the house stood up. Josuke patted him on the shoulder after saying goodbye and made his way to his room while the other two adults walked him to the door. "Thank you again for saving my life, young man. If you ever find yourself in a bind, don't hesitate to call me up, you have my card." Naruto smiled at the eldest Higashikata and bowed as was Japanese custom. "It was no big deal, but I appreciate the gesture. I'll keep the card with me just in case." Inwardly he knew that at some point in the future, he would definitely be calling him, he was just a trouble magnet. Turning to Tomoko, he bowed again, only not as far down as he did for her father. "Thank you for letting me in your home and getting a chance to have a nice dinner. Remember, my offer is always open." Tomoko closed her eyes and smirked, leaning slightly against the open door. "I'll think it over, be careful on the way home, it isn't safe around here after dark." Nodding to each, he began walking down the pathway to the sidewalk, only turning back once to wave back. As he was near the sidewalk he overheard the police officer ask his daughter what this offer was just as the door closed. He hoped she would take him up on his offer, not just because she was arguably one of the most attractive people he'd met, but because he could see that there was something of a sadness to her. The fact that her father was there but not Josuke's told him either they were divorced or he was dead. There were slight problems with each of those however, as regardless of which option one chose, there would be at least one image of them in the house. From the quick scan he'd gotten of the place, the pictures were that of the older man, Tomoko, and Josuke. Being a single mom must take its toll, he thought. Apart from having to raise someone by herself, there seemed to be something else bothering her. Everyone had a good time both enjoying the food and with conversation except her who seemed to be lost in her thoughts. If he could do something to cheer her up, he'd love to do so. When he arrived back at the hotel, had been quickly accosted by Mariah asking him how it went. She wanted details about the whole event, as if it was some important meeting he attended. Of course that was followed by gloating on her part about having been right that he would enjoy himself. Despite having had a good time, she still quickly tossed him onto the bed and began removing his clothing. She said it was a reward for herself for being right, and he certainly wasn't going to turn it down. XXXX. The next day the pair was up bright and early, having breakfast at a nearby small restaurant. Both of them had a certain glow about them as they ate, still feeling the effects of the previous night's activities. So Mariah began, taking a bite of her breakfast. "What's on the agenda today?" Naruto swallowed the bite he'd taken and took a sip of his drink, continuing to get familiar with the area. "I know there's quite a few stand users in the city. There's a high chance that the person responsible for the disappearances is among them. Discerning who they are will be difficult though. You done?" Taking the last bite of food on the plate, the woman pushed the plate forward and sighed in content. "Yeah." Putting the plates on top of one another and tidying the table up, the two made their way to the register to pay for the meal. Once they were outside, they began heading towards another part of the city that they had yet to explore. Well, they were here for business. Naruto couldn't help but take a few pictures of the landmarks that Morioh had, much to his partner's amusement. Some things didn't change, it seemed. Continuing along, the two walked along the sidewalk, memorizing as much of the streets as they could. If there really was someone here causing disappearances, chances were they had the entire city memorized, giving them a competitive advantage. If they could eliminate that, it would level the playing field a tad bit. Mariah looked up at the name of a certain store on their left-hand side and didn't notice someone walking in their direction until it was too late. With a soft grunt of displeasure, she took a step back to see who had bumped into her. The man was wearing a light purple suit with a light blue striped button up under the jacket. The jacket was left open, revealing the shirt, as well as a dark tie that had a strange design on it. His hair was blonde, just a tad darker than Naruto's own. It was slicked back, leaving two strands hanging down the front of his face. "I'm sorry," the man apologized in a polite tone. Naruto narrowed his eyes at the man, not because of what had transpired, but because of the aura coming off of him. He gave off a bad vibe, and Naruto was almost positive he was a stand user. He seemed polite enough, but something in the back of his mind told him to be ready. "Don't worry about it," Mariah responded as she patted her skirt down. "I wasn't paying that much attention either." Naruto kept his eyes on the suited man and noticed his gaze. He frowned at the action. The man wasn't staring at her breasts like any other man would tried to do, but rather his gaze was focused on her hands, not a quick glance, but a full-on gaze. Was there something on her that he couldn't see? No, that couldn't be it. There was nothing wrong with them. Her tanned skin was as flawless as it had been after she applied lotion in the morning. The only thing different about her hands was the perfectly applied white nail polish. As if sensing his stare, the man turned to look at him and shot him a polite smile and a nod. "Again, I'm truly sorry for the inconvenience. If y'all excuse me, I can't be late to work." He sounded normal enough, but Naruto could see the man's right hand begin to twitch and then hide behind him. Maybe some sort of tic, Naruto thought. "Before you leave," Naruto called out politely, "we didn't catch your name." The man blinked and nodded. "Apologies, Yashiga Kira." "Mariah," the woman replied in a bored tone. "Tapeli Naruto," the blonde replied shortly after. Kira took a moment to repeat the names to himself, getting a feel for how they rolled off the tongue, and then nodded slowly. He bowed ever so slightly and continued on, though not without one final look at the woman's hands. "I don't like that guy," Naruto commented as soon as Kira turned the corner. Mariah smirked and placed a hand up to her cheek, "Jealous that another blonde was talking to me?" she teased. Naruto chortled at her accusation. "You're funny." "No, it was his weird fascination with your hands that weirded me out." "My hands?" she asked, bringing her hands up to her face. "What's wrong with them?" "I thought he was trying to look at my tits." He shook his head. "Nope, hands plus something in that stare of his really put me on edge. The best way I could describe the feeling of that man would be cold." Just as she was about to reply and ask, Naruto held a hand up and nodded to the other side of the street. Staring at them with a blank face was Jotaro. He stopped and checked both ways before crossing the street. On instinct, Mariah took a step back, making sure she was in a position behind Naruto. The blonde wasn't worried, however. After their last exchange, he was sure the man would attack, and he was right. "Naruto," Jotaro greeted Mariah. "Jotaro, good to see you again," he replied amicably. "Is there something you need?" The white-clad man nodded and motioned his head in another direction. "Not here, let's get a drink." Naruto turned to Mariah, who shrugged and held on to his arm. The blonde trekked along, wondering just what they were about to find out. Thanks for watching.